I'm now delighted to welcome to the stage our artistic director. We're thrilled to be working with the Het Nieuwe Instituut, the Dutch National Museum and Institute for Architecture, Design and Digital Culture, headed by Aric Chen. Ladies and gentlemen, Aric Chen.
Thank you, Vicky, and also thank you, Renata, for those really wonderful words. It's so nice to be here on behalf of the New Institute, Het Nieuwe Instituut. I'm joined here by my colleagues Josine Paulidis, Taco de Neff, Joyce Hansen, and Francine van Vestrenen, who you'll be all meeting later today as she moderates the third and closing session of the program. Now, as a quick introduction, as Vicky mentioned, the Het Nieuwe Instituut, the New Institute, is the Netherlands National Museum and Institute for Architecture, Design and Digital Culture. Now, on the one hand, we're a museum in the sense that we have a collection, namely the Dutch National Collection and Archives of Architecture and Urban Planning. We do exhibitions, public programs, etc. But we're also an institute in the sense that we fulfill a number of other functions and roles, policy functions, internationalization. We commission the Dutch Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale and other venues throughout the world. But one role we have never, as far as I know, taken is that of institutional artistic director for a biennial. So we really have to thank Vicky and her amazing team at the London Design Biennial for taking this leap of faith with us as we propose doing next year's London Design Biennial a little bit differently. Oh, is this better or the same? Same, okay. Well, oh, here we go, good. So we essentially are proposing playing with the biennial's format of national and territorial pavilions this time around to create a game of collaboration called the Global Game, designed by the game designer Ekin Tan, who is here, and Mark Stope of Scenarios 4, both of whom you'll meet a little bit later as well. Now, the context of this game, which is aiming to prompt and encourage participants to find new ways of collaborating with each other through the process of the biennial, the context is, of course, a geopolitical one. In talking about geopolitics, it really occurred to me that this is an area in which I am eminently unqualified to speak about, especially at Chatham House. As Chris Turner pointed out earlier, thank God for Chatham House rules. In these kinds of situations, I found that the best and perhaps only strategy you can take is to turn what you're speaking about into a personal story. So that's what I'm going to do, so please bear with me. And I'm going to start with this image, which many of you may recognize from last year, March. It is of the container ship Ever Given, as it was moving from Asia to, of all places, Rotterdam. It got grounded in the Suez Canal, blocking traffic there and causing a massive disarray and disruption in global shipping for weeks and months afterwards. Now, this became another example, perhaps, of the fragility of our global supply chain systems, also perhaps a metaphor for the increasingly tenuous state of globalization itself. Now, as this was happening, I was living in Shanghai, and it was just a month or two after I had been offered and accepted my new role at the New Institute. And so what happened with the Ever Given also prompted me to think of how I was going to get to Rotterdam myself. Now, in the broader context, as a Chinese American who had been living in China, first Beijing, then Hong Kong, and finally Shanghai for 13 years, I arrived in 2008 in Beijing at a moment when the US had just elected Barack Obama. Beijing and China was still kind of riding high off the 2008 Beijing Summer Olympics and how it represented a rising China that was increasingly open and interconnected with the rest of the world. Now, as time progressed, of course, the situation has changed a lot. Those were rosier times in retrospect, and the shifts in the relationship between, in this case, China and the US was something that was very palpable to me, again, as a Chinese American living in China. Now, of course, I was the only one who was feeling and noticing these changes. As we all know, since really, let's say 2008, the global financial crisis, the globalization that we've all sort of taken for granted since the 90s. I suppose the cliche is that moment when the Berlin Wall fell, the Cold War was over, the end of history, the World Trade Organization was established. It was inevitable somehow that borders would continue to open and the circulation of people, goods, and ideas would become ever freer. That moment was drawing to a close already. And as we sort of were looking at what was happening, many people, as you can see, were trying to find ways of sort of visualizing the world as a planet that was maybe unspooling, deflating, fracturing. Now, of course, there is still an acknowledgement that we were still nevertheless intertwined as always. And so it perhaps wasn't a kind of deglobalization that we were witnessing, but a sort of deglobalization and reglobalization working at the same time, a kind of post-global condition in which countries and other political entities were still kind of reaching outward in their own terms, finding points of contact and perhaps friction with others as they were trying to sort of span the globe themselves. In ways that reflected a planet that was still increasingly tightly bound, but perhaps also a place where things could snap seemingly at any moment. Now, I'm showing you sort of mainstream kind of visualizations of what people were seeing going on, but in other realms, you had projects like the Migrant Journal, a 6-issue project between 2015 and 2019 by a group of designers, art directors, architects, and others who were examining the circulation of people, goods, ideas, information, flora, and fauna, and looking also at their spatial implications. Now, these sort of implications took any number of forms by looking at, for example, the extraction and movement of sand around the world for use in concrete construction and land reclamation. The spread of pop culture and music genres through platforms like YouTube and Spotify. And then others, like my own institute, and this happened before my time, so I can't take credit for any of it, but the New Institute, in collaboration with Design Earth and others, was around the same time launching a program called Vertical Atlas, a series of research labs and workshops examining the technopolitics the technopolitics of 5 sort of identified geozones, they called it, the EU, where they were examining the EU's data privacy protection efforts in the context of the borderless reality of cyberspace, looking at Africa and the extraction of minerals for some of the technological tools that we use, but as a composite of a landscape or condition in which multinational tech companies were beginning to dominate African cyberspace with their cloud computing platforms. Meanwhile, indigenous native technological developments were asserting their own visions of a technological and wired future for that continent. Also China with AI and the use of AI in both economic and political governance, as well as in the Chinese cultural imaginary. So all of these things were being examined, excuse me, in ways that really began to tease out the sort of infinite means by which we were inextricably linked, but also those links were increasingly becoming playing out in rather convoluted ways. Sorry, these are some of the 5 geozones that the Vertical Atlas was looking at, and this is all being put into a book as we speak. Now, going back to things, though, designers were themselves examining these very complicated webs of interactions and supply chains and the movement of resources and people and so on and so forth. I'm going to focus on this one now famously chaotic example by Thomas Thwaites, who at the time in 2008, when he undertook this project, was a student at the Royal Academy of Arts here in London. I believe this was his graduation project, but Thomas decided, I guess one day, that he wanted to see if he could make a toaster. Now, the point was not to make toast, of course, but to really look at to really explore whether it was possible to make a toaster using as few industrial techniques and processes as possible, and by working as locally as possible. So over 9 months, Thomas scavenged decommissioned mines to sort of gather little bits of ore, which he forged into iron in a homemade furnace jury-rigged from a microwave. He went to mountains in Scotland to sort of chip away little bits of mica. He went to abandoned Welsh copper mines and leached as much copper as he could from the sort of stagnant ponds of water that he found. And he managed to leach enough to kind of make the toaster's wiring and plug. For the plastic casing, he gathered household projects from his own home and kind of chop them up and melted them down and formed them into the toaster's shell using a mold that he hand hacked from a piece of wood. Now, this toaster, this project was successful in the sense that he did wind up with something that vaguely resembled a toaster, and I believe this is now in the collection of the V&A. And it also kind of worked. He did plug it in, and it kind of worked for about 5 seconds until it caught fire and was burnt to a crisp. I guess this is what it's like in the V&A collection now. And really what this did was, prove the impossibility of something that had become impossible, right? We are so intertwined and so entangled within these global industrial systems that it's sort of a fool's errand to try to work outside them, or so we think. To kind of even emphasize the futility of this exercise, Thomas calculated, in fact, how much such a toaster would cost, and I think he wound up at a number of 1,187 pounds in a marketplace in which most toasters cost between 15 and 25 pounds. Now, 2008, as I mentioned before, the year Obama was elected, the year I went to Beijing during a time of sort of post-Olympic euphoria and optimism, was, as we all know, also ended by the global financial crisis. And at this moment, the sort of flaws and shortcomings, the inequalities of global capitalism were really brought into stark relief, fueling perhaps the kind of nativist and nationalistic impulses that we increasingly see today, or that we've increasingly seen ever since. This has prompted many people to sort of look back to sort of see a more nuanced view of the kind of maps and cartographic understandings of the world that we perhaps had taken for granted. This is a detail of a map by the Chinese artist Zhou Zhijie. He made this for a show at the Guggenheim in 2017, but it's a series of really incredible maps where he kind of uses Chinese landscape painting techniques to illustrate different historical moments, different types of social relationships, and in this case, the history of contemporary Chinese art post-1989, when contemporary Chinese art really emerged on the global landscape through the mechanisms of globalization and China's greater opening and increasing engagement with parts of the outside world, with other parts of the outside world. But even within this map, in this corner of the map that you see here, we can see how the canyon of globalization, surrounded by the plain or the beach of the European Union and the ASEAN Free Trade Zone, still face the barrier in the form of the mountain range of the clash of civilizations that separated it from the main kind of narrative arc of contemporary Chinese art that he represented above. Here, The Clash of Civilizations is referring to a well-known essay by Samuel Huntington, in which the West and the Islamic world were defined in opposition to each other, but by now, the clash between Western and, let's say, Chinese civilizations was coming more to the fore, and Zhou Zhijie was making that very apparent through this work. Other ways of visualization, the French designer Louise Drouel, who has been kind of mapping the topography of the worldwide web, or perhaps a worldwide web which is not as worldwide anymore, as it shifted from this very sort of idealistic, seamless notion of a seamless, frictionless, or flat way of connecting people and bringing ideas together, and how it's now transformed into a more pockmarked landscape of troughs and wormholes dominated by big tech and the state. In my mind, I was always sort of looking back at this project by the Dutch visionary artist Constant Nieuwenhuis from the 1970s, in which he proposed this labyrinth of doors. This was part of a larger kind of utopian project of his called New Babylon. And here, he created a labyrinth in which that was formed from a series of pivoting perpendicular doors, so that as you move through it, as one door closed, the other would open, and the other way around. This was actually made in 1974 at The Hague, and actually recreated a few years ago when there was a big Constant show at The Hague once again, and in Barcelona. Now, this wasn't Constant's intention, but this image always sort of stayed with me in the sense that it sort of represented for me a global landscape that was no longer even pretending to work under any notion of a meta-narrative, but instead seemed to be comprised of a series of micro zero-sum games of efficacy that provided no clear pathway, but at the same time many pathways, and how one navigates that then becomes, let's say, the global game. Now, it was around this time that I was asked to curate a show at the Museum of Art, Architecture and Technology, MAT, in Lisbon. And this was a show that I curated with Martina Muzzi. This is a show called X is Not a Small Country, Unraveling the Post-Global Era. Now, this opened last year, but it was conceived in 2019 when I was first invited to do this, before the pandemic. But of course, the pandemic definitely provided a new kind of interesting context for it. Now, the premise of this show was to really look at the kind of realignments and reconfigurations and ever-shifting, convoluted global relationships that we were witnessing, whereby we were looking at a world of trade wars and refugee crises, of constantly shifting alliances that sort of really undermined many of the expectations that many people perhaps had. It was a time when the liberal democracies of the West seemed to be turning inward, while governments that were not known for this were positioning themselves as bastions of openness. Suddenly, countries that had refused to recognize each other for decades overnight seemed to be establishing diplomatic relations. And of course, there was this thing that I promised I wouldn't mention, but it begins with a B and rhymes with exit. That all sort of pointed to a new condition that was playing out, but not yet understood. For me, how the show itself played out in Portugal began with my first visit ever to Portugal for this show in 2019, and I was struck by my conversations with people there who were pointing out, on the one hand, how post-financial crisis Portugal was increasingly reliant on capital from many of its former colonial relations, namely Angola, as well as China, the former relationship there being, of course, Macau. And at the same time, how many felt like there was a lack of a discourse about Portugal's colonial past. While having these discussions, I came across this poster, which is well known in Portugal, but I'd never seen it before, from 1934 by Henrique Galvão, called "Portugal is Not a Small Country." Now, this was made during the Novo Estado regime, which was Portugal's kind of quasi-fascist government of the 1930s, very ultra-nationalist. And one of the ideas that they were proffering was this notion of pluricontinentalism, which I found fascinating. It was the idea that Portugal was not a country with far-flung colonies, but rather a pluricontinental nation in which those colonies were integral parts of Portugal's sovereignty. And the way in which this really highlighted the ability of, our ability to kind of reimagine cartography and geography through the apparatuses of state and other agendas was incredibly striking. And looking at this at a moment when some of these colonial relationships were seemingly being reversed, meaning Portugal becoming more dependent on Angola and China, it seemed to be a good thing to kind of begin to examine. Now, like geopolitics at Chatham House, I was clearly in no position to be doing a show on Portuguese post-colonialism, so we used this more as a prompt through which we could commission designers from all over the world to investigate these kinds of dynamics in their own geographies. So I'll just give a few examples. The sort of most literal one, the kind of warm-up installation for our audience at the beginning of the show was this installation of a series of pro-EU, anti-Brexit posters that the photographer Wolfgang Tillmans created in 2016 and 2019, coinciding with the Brexit referendum here, but also a number of national elections on the continent in Europe in which nationalist parties were questioning the viability of the EU, and this is something that we, of course, hope that our visitors could just immediately relate to. But then we had other projects. This is by a Portuguese architect named Paulo Moreira, who was with collaborators and other researchers looking at and working with a migrant community on the outskirts of Lisbon called Jamaica. This is an area of informal architecture where a lot of migrants from many of Portugal's former African colonies live. They were subjected to various forms of discrimination and racism, and also efforts to displace them, which were ultimately successful. But the irony being, this was on land that we believe, that we couldn't quite nail it, was owned by an Angolan company. Just very quickly, some other projects. Jing He, a Chinese designer based in the Netherlands, came up with what she calls a kind of engine, a sort of tectonic history and future-making machine through which she kind of rejiggered the relationships between China, Cambodia, North Korea, and France in order to create speculative new scenarios in the future through the typology of the Arc de Triomphe. It's a little complicated, but just trust me on this. It was great. Ibe Camp, a Nigerian designer based in London, was also looking at speculative future scenarios in the Niger Delta, using augmented reality and examining what the possibilities for that heavily polluted due to the oil industry region might be, what it might be like in a post-petrol world. The Saudi architecture studio Brick Lab, they created our public program space. by designing this installation that was a reflection on the history of different typologies of cinemas, of public cinemas in Saudi Arabia, and their sort of social, their social functions before the ban on public cinema was put in place in, I believe, the 1980s. And they were doing this at a time when, of course, that ban was lifted, and cinemas are now being built throughout the country. And within this cinema, we invited Aric Chen to curate a program of video works by artists from the region, looking at some of these issues of globalization in that region. This was an interesting case. This is by the Mumbai studio, Bard Studio, Rupali Gupta and Prashad Shetty. This is an installation sort of inspired by the informal architecture of Mumbai, but really as a kind of as an armature for presenting objects through which they investigated how the narratives of objects, both psychically and functionally, change as they move from China, where they're produced, to India. And this was being worked on while there were a series of border skirmishes or battles between India and China at their Himalayan border, which some of you may remember as well. As this was happening, the Indian government had banned Chinese apps, from the Indian internet. The Chinese government sort of responded in all sorts of ways in kind, and to see this sort of process happening as they were working on this project added another sort of layer of meaning to it. Now, I guess the kind of subtext of the whole show was that we are living at a time when more of these are being erected. Walls, not just physical walls, but virtual walls, cultural walls, political walls, maybe even ideological walls. And these are things that we as a design community have probably not so much control over. But what we can do is this. And this is a project by the Oakland, California-based studio, Rael Sanfratello. In 2019, they went to the border wall between the US and Mexico. And for 40 minutes, this was not a government-sanctioned intervention. For 40 minutes, they were able to slip these bright millennial pink seesaws through the gaps in the wall, which allowed both adults and children on both sides of the border to play with each other. Now, this was a strong statement about dismantling these psychic and physical walls that we are erecting. It's also a sort of a way of looking at the different imbalances and inequalities that we create through the construction of these walls. But it also was a way of encouraging collaboration, and collaboration through play, perhaps even as a game. And here is that wall and intervention reconstructed in the Lisbon exhibition. It looks a little bit sad and desolate there, but people could use it, and people did use it. So I'm going to end this brief keynote by making reference to Buckminster Fuller, who has come up already today and who will come up later again today. Buckminster Fuller was the American inventor, designer, architect, systems theorist, visionary. In the 1940s, he was serving in the US Navy. During that time, he was exposed to many of the war games that the US Navy was playing at that period. And he began to think about how to sort of turn these war games on their head into games of collaboration, even as early as the 1940s. And by the 1960s, he had proposed what he called, at first, the World Peace Game, became later known simply as the World Game. It was closely linked to his iconic Dymaxion map, which you see on the wall behind him in this image. This was a new projection of the Earth's geography on an icosahedron. It was meant to be. It was meant to show the different ways in which you can position the different geographies of the Earth, the continental geographies, in order to examine different kinds and directionalities of those relationships, while also representing the inhabited by humans planet as more or less a single island. Now, in this world game, which was really kind of a series of workshops and talks and exercises, Fuller wanted to bring people together, to find new ways of collaboration, to, as he put it, make the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offense or the disadvantage of anyone. Now, I think we can all agree that those words should hopefully still ring true today. We have a special treat later when Francine and Kim and Marx introduce the game that we're working on. We'll have, in fact, Fuller's grandson, Jamie Snyder, joining us to talk a little bit more about Fuller's legacy and its relevance today. But in the meantime, I'll just end this by asking, now in 2021, or 2022, sorry, but for a biennial in 2023, what will the map of the global game look like? And maybe on a last personal note, since I began this on a personal note, I'll end it on a personal note. As a Chinese American director of a Dutch European national institution, who's been given the privilege of curating a London Design Biennial in the aftermath of the B word. I hope that we will all find incredible ways to collaborate and show that there is still a lot to be done, but a lot to be done in a good and hopeful way. So thank you.
Oh,